In this segment, I'm going to use a series of maps to give you a global look at who Indigenous peoples are and where they live around the world. I'm calling the In this segment, I'm going to use a series of maps to give you a global look at who Indigenous peoples are and where they live around the world. I'm calling the segment Mapping the Fourth World, based on a term for the global collection of Indigenous peoples that came out of intercontinental Indigenous rights organizing in the 1970s. So when we talk about how many Indigenous peoples there are today, you often see a reference to a number like this: more than 350 million, or more than 370 million. This number has a particular source, which is a report put out by the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2006 that concluded there were over 5,000 Indigenous peoples living in at least 72 states, which is what I will call nations or countries today. There hasn't been another comprehensive global survey, as far as I'm aware, of Indigenous peoples around the world. However, this number is hotly contested, and there's an enormous range of possible values for the global Indigenous population. I think that you'll see as we build a global perspective together in this brief video that this number is likely far too low. So Mirjam Hirsch, a former UN special rapporteur who works for the Center for World Indigenous Studies, put out this statement in 2007. Quote, "The Permanent Forum has a fairly limited interpretation of who are the Indigenous peoples. It is our observation at the center that there are from 6,000 to 7,000 nations that speak original languages and generally occupy territories in virtually every continent in the world. We have estimated that the number of people who might be identified as Indigenous people worldwide at a minimum of 750 million, and perhaps as many as a billion people." Hirsch's statement was put out at a time when the global population was around 7 billion. It's now around 8.2 billion, so one can estimate that both these totals would be substantially higher than they were 18 years ago. Now, here's one simplistic global map of Indigenous peoples. It's perhaps not representative. It was put out by the National Geographic Society of the United States, which is an unofficial, non-governmental organization. I'll zoom in a bit, and you can see a lot of unevenness, but you can also see particular regions being identified as significant locations for large numbers of Indigenous people. Definitely, we have a range of Indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, of which the Maya in Central America and the Amazon region and the Andes are quite significant. We also have Indigenous peoples in Africa, with a high density in Central Africa, and the Berber communities and desert migrants of the Sahara Desert, as well as Southeast and South Asia, particularly in the interior. You can also see running across the top of this map peoples from the Arctic circumpolar region, many of whom retain distinct cultures from the nation states of which they're part. You definitely see the highland regions of Asia, particularly the Himalayas and inland Southeast Asia, and then the islands of Southeast Asia highlighted here, as well as the continent of Australia. I'm going to take you on a survey of different world regions and talk a little bit about the scale of population and the diversity of Indigenous peoples in each of them. First off, I'm going to start in East and Southeast Asia. The area of focus here is the Himalayan Plateau in upland Central Asia. That's in orange. This is an area that includes Nepal and Bhutan, independent nation states that are overwhelmingly indigenous, but also millions of indigenous peoples living in India and the People's Republic of China. In Southeast Asia, you have this upland region in red, sometimes called Zomia, and that's an area in which you have a wide ethnic diversity. Even if we just looked inside of the state of China, we see that there are some 117 million people classified as minority ethnic groups, the five largest of which together are 64 million people, which is a really massive number. The Center for World Indigenous Studies estimates there may be significantly more people who are actually living in indigenous lifeways without being counted in this way, but may be formally and inaccurately counted as Han Chinese. In South Asia, in India, and similarly in Pakistan and Nepal as well, you have groups that are described as scheduled tribes, and these are people with distinct lifeways who live inside the Indian nation state but are allowed certain forms of tribal autonomy. They comprised 104 million people in the last Indian census, which was taken in 2011. In Pakistan, there are designated tribal areas that have substantial populations as well, and this term Adivasi is also used in Bangladesh and Nepal. In the state of Indonesia, there's an organization called the Aliansi Masyarakat Adat Nusantara, which is the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, and you'll see highlighted in the dark red here places where Indigenous peoples live under Indonesian jurisdiction. This AMAN itself comprises member communities of 2,512 indigenous communities, many of whom are grouped together into larger peoples with an estimated total population of over 19 million. But AMAN also looks broader across the country and sees an estimated 50 to 70 million people who would qualify under the definition of indigenous peoples. In what's sometimes called Oceania, the island states of the Pacific, including New Guinea and in the far west, and as far south as New Zealand, you have a wide variety of indigenous groups. These were classified into cultural areas by anthropologists for reasons that were not always laudable and are often racial, but these three vast regions, Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, are a place of tremendous cultural diversity and many conserved indigenous traditions. There were also places that in the waves of European colonization were among the last places to be colonized. If we look, for example, at New Guinea, the eastern half of this was colonized by the Dutch, and then that was taken over by Australia as a colony, a settler colony. And the western half of Indonesia is part of Indonesia and was labeled by the Indonesian government Irian Jaya. These are both places with tremendous cultural diversity, as is reflected in this linguistic map, which you see here. If we turn to the Middle East, we have a variety of ethnic minority populations which often conserve traditional lifeways. Among the indigenous groups here are people sometimes called Arab marsh dwellers in southern Iraq, the Bedouins across the region, including in the West Bank and the Negev desert in Israel, many of whom live there in villages that are not given formal recognition by the state and denied other amenities. The Assyrian peoples who live in an arc of the mountains shown in dark red between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq here, as well as the Kurdish people. Very few of these groups in the Middle East are recognized as indigenous by their own nation states, and they're often, as in the case of the Kurds, involved in international and regional conflicts. In North Africa, there's a significant number of Berber peoples, which is a sort of super classification of ethnic groups numbering somewhere between 20 and 50 million people, if one includes both those living near the coast as well as nomadic populations that live in the Sahara Desert. Then, if one looks at Africa as a whole, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and this will be a point where I need to interject with the complication of how does one think about indigeneity in places where settler colonialism was not a dominant way of understanding or shaping the state. In Africa, we can think about the ways that peoples have conserved cultural traditions and separateness from each local state, maintain a cultural separation, and so on. And even in cases where there was not an active process of settlement, there was a process by which some ethnic groups monopolized national politics and other ones were relegated to the margins. One of the places where you see this the most is this area that you see around the Bight of Biafra here, the Niger Delta region. This is the river delta where the Niger pours into the Atlantic in the southern part of the nation state of Nigeria. And the delta has a truly bafflingly large number of distinct ethnic groups, including indigenous peoples, whereas the nation state, which is concentrated in the capital city of Lagos and more recently in the newer capital city of Abuja further north, was dominated by three large ethnic groups of Nigeria. And a lot of other peoples have been relegated to the periphery of power in the country. So there's a massive number of ethnicities in Africa, but thinking about which of these are self-identified as indigenous is a complex matter. Mark Leo Felix writes in a description of why some of the ways that claims to being indigenous in Africa are related to a cluster of characteristics: political and economic marginalization rooted in colonialism, discrimination often based in the dominance of agricultural peoples in the state system, the particularities of cultural identity, economy and territoriality that link hunting and herding peoples to their home environments in deserts and forests, and the ways that some indigenous peoples, such as the San and Pygmy peoples, are physically distinct, which makes them subjects to specific forms of discrimination. There is also an Indigenous People of Africa Coordinating Committee, which pulls together 135 Indigenous people organizations based in 20 countries. Turning to the Arctic polar region, as I mentioned, there's a wide variety of Siberian, Northern European, Alaska Native, Greenlandic, and Arctic or Inuit communities that all have collectively organized themselves into an Arctic Council of Indigenous Groups. You can see in their various constituent organizations here in this map. I'll zoom in a bit so you can get a sense of the particular cultural diversity that's involved. These are substantial regions for indigenous people, even though their populations are relatively small compared with some of the other regions around the world. If we look inside of Canada, we see that there are three different categories of Indigenous peoples. There are First Nations, which are indicated in brown on this map here, in places where they have a majority within Canada. They're the Métis, who are descendants of mixed race communities that were formed early on between European colonists, largely French, and First Nations people, but continue to maintain independent cultural continuity since then. Notably, Métis is an individual description. It's not an individual description, it's a description of a community. And then finally, the Inuit, northern Indigenous peoples who share a common linguistic family, the Eskimo-Aleut language family. In the 2011 National Household Survey of Canadians, altogether 1.4 million people, about 4.3% of all Canadians fit into one of these Indigenous categories. So looking across North America, or at least Canada and the United States together, we can see just a really exceptionally diverse range of Indigenous communities. It's one way of thinking through and re-examining our own geography as a continent that consists of over 800 different homelands, while acknowledging that many peoples were subjected to depopulation in their own lands or exile from them. Next, I want to look at the continental United States in terms of where Indigenous peoples form either a plurality or majority, which you can see on this map. This map shows a handful of highly concentrated places, which reflects the dispossession and enclosure of Indigenous peoples in Indian reservations, which were produced through the policy of Indian removal. But conversely, while these are areas of concentration that you see here, if you look at the United States differently, and we look at raw population density of Native Americans or American Indians and Alaska Natives, according to census categories, you get a very different picture. Here, the map reflects the urban geography of the United States, in which Indigenous peoples currently live in the United States. Only about 36% of self-identified American Indians and Alaska Natives live in their designated territories. Also not visible on this map, but counted as well, are Pacific Islanders who are native to territories controlled by the United States. So there are about 5.7 million people who checked the Native American or Alaska Native box on the 2018 America Community Survey. And so around 5.7 million people are Native Americans. 1.9 million of them are Pacific Islanders, the bulk of whom have U.S. territorial roots, including 630,000 Native Hawaiians, 213,000 Samoans, and 182,000 peoples of Guam. There are 5 metro areas in the United States that have Native American population in excess of 100,000 people: Los Angeles, New York, Phoenix, Tulsa, and Oklahoma City. In Mexico, the census also registers a very large quantity of people as Indigenous through self-identification. Is about 21.5% of the population, or nearly 26 million people in 2015. You can see that there are 4 Mexican states that have Indigenous majorities, including Oaxaca, and the 3 states that make up the Yucatan Peninsula, as well as a substantial number that have over 40% Indigenous population. In Central America, the Indigenous population is overwhelmingly Maya peoples and their descendants, people who have background and roots in the extensive Maya Empire of the classical first millennium of this region. In South America, there are approximately, depending on how you cut this, 32 million Indigenous peoples living there, making South America about 7 or 8% Indigenous. The share of Indigenous peoples varies widely from Bolivia, where it can be as high as 40 to 70% of the population who self-identifies as a descended from an Indigenous group, whereas in Colombia and Brazil, you have less than 1% of the population self-identifying as Indigenous. But in both these countries, they're quite significant in terms of the share of national territory in which they live, which is somewhere that they have some homelands and also some control over. Overall, in the Western Hemisphere, you have this huge variation from places like Greenland and some provinces of Bolivia and Guatemala, where there's 90% Indigenous population, to Canada with 4%, the United States with 1 to 2, Central America around a quarter Indigenous, and South America a little more like 1 in 12. But overall in the Americas, we can think of there being over 70 million Indigenous peoples. All in all, our tour has visited regions touching 58 countries, of about 190 member states in the United Nations, and this chart shows the estimated 494 to 634 million Indigenous peoples mentioned in that incomplete survey. The International Labour Organization went and updated the United Nations estimate with newer census data, giving a global total For 2019 of 476 million people from at least 58 countries, and based pretty tightly on census data from those countries, so we have to regard this as an absolute minimum estimate. The Center for World Indigenous Studies likewise updated its top estimate and provided a world indigenous population of 1.3 billion in 2014. Overall, we can say that somewhere between 1 in 16 and 1 in 6 people alive today are indigenous, with the overwhelming majority, as well as the majority of the uncertainty, in Asia and in Africa.